and a big welcome to you all, and thank you for joining us for our first JBI live webinar for 2023 with Dr. Timothy Barker presenting to us about the new JBI critical appraisal tool for assessing risk of bias in randomised controlled trials. My name is Eduardo Aramataris. I am the Director of Synthesis Science here in JBI and also Editor-in-Chief of one of our journals, and that is JBI Evidence Synthesis. And it's my absolute pleasure to be hosting today's webinar focused on this topic, about which I'm sure many of you be well aware of, is indeed a defining feature of many reviews of existing research, and certainly any systematic review of current JBI methodologies that can actually lay claim to being systematic. That is this idea of critical appraisal of the studies that are included within the review. The process that Tim's going to be speaking about today, this idea of is principally focused on assessing the quality of conduct. That other term that you'll hear Tim use, I'm sure, is validity, or that possibility or potential that bias has crept into the design, conduct, or analysis of the study in question. This assessment of risk of bias is a critical consideration in the analysis and interpretation of any synthesis. And as reviewers, in part, this is the process that allows us to lay claim to presenting the best available evidence to readers and users of our work. With that in mind, I do hope that this presentation holds your interest, and I'm sure we'll also provide some immediate practical insight for those of you currently undertaking or indeed planning a systematic review. Before we go further, I would like to acknowledge that we are delivering this webinar from the lands of the Kaurna people here in South Australia of the Adelaide Plains. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which you all work today and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who may be participating in the webinar today. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing cultures and connection to the lands and waters of Australia. I'd like to introduce, it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Tim Barker, who is a research fellow currently within the Health Evidence Synthesis Recommendations and Impact Group, or HESRI, within the School of Public Health at the University of Adelaide. He's also the lead researcher of the JBI Adelaide Grade Centre, and he currently serves as chair of the JBI Effectiveness Methodology Group and the JBI Predatory Publishing Working Group. And indeed, much of the work that he'll be telling us about today stems from the combined efforts of the JBI Effectiveness Methodology Group. Beyond all of that, Tim is a research methodologist, a clinical epidemiologist, with experience in systematic reviews of effectiveness, prognostic factors and prevalence data, and also in clinical guideline development. So Tim, welcome, and please take it away. I'll hand over to you. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you. So my name is Tim Barker, and as I said, I'm going to present on a lot of the work that I have been doing in my role as chair of the JBI Effectiveness Methods Group, particularly this redevelopment or revisions of the risk of bias tools or critical appraisal tools that we offer, running through our first revised critical appraisal tool that we have made available, which is the tool for RCTs. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge that the land that I am joining this webinar from today is the traditional lands of the Kaurna people, and that I do respect their spiritual relationship with their country. I also want to acknowledge the Kaurna people as the traditional custodians of the Adelaide region, and that their cultural and heritage beliefs are still as important to the living Kaurna people today. And I would like to extend that respect to the cultural authority of other Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people who have joined this webinar from other areas of South Australia and Australia. Here are my professional disclosures, but Ed did mention most of them, so I won't go too much into them. But here they are. And finally, before I get into the meat of the presentation, I just want to also acknowledge that the work that I'm going to be talking about today, it isn't my work. This is work from an entire group of people. My name is attached to it, and I am chair of this group of people, but this work is really the combined effort of many great minds working together to produce this. This was a lot of work, you'll see, hopefully, in this presentation. But I do specifically want to mention Dr. Catalin Tufanaru. So Catalin passed away in July of 2021. And this work actually began in early 2021. Catalin was a long-standing member of the JBI Effectiveness Methods Group. He created many of the tools, guidance, and chapters of the JBI Manual for Evidence Synthesis that the JBI still use today. And his contribution to the work that I'm going to present was significant. Okay, so I've broken up this talk into 4 parts, not all of them of equal length or importance, but I'm going to first introduce this idea of bias. Hopefully this will be a revision for a lot of you, and then tool structures and approaches that systematic reviewers can use to assess bias in their reviews. I'm then going to talk about the approach that we followed as the JBI Effectiveness Methods Group to safeguard our tools for the future. And then I'm going to start actually getting into the new RCT tool before closing with what's next and future plans. So that all sounds good. Strap in. So part 1, tool structures for risk of bias. So a quick refresher. Bias is systematic error, and bias can arise in research through the implementation or lack of implementation of what I'm going to call safeguards. Now, safeguards, as I've got here in this image, this image isn't mine, by the way. This image comes from the Graded Working Group. Safeguards are situations or actions that somebody can employ as part of doing primary research, and the implementation of these safeguards helps to minimize the risk of bias in that study's conduct. Okay, so as an example in this image, let me just bring up my laser pointer. We have the safeguards that people can employ and the impact on the types of bias on either side of this. So for example, one of the methodological safeguards that a primary researcher can employ would be randomization. And by employing randomization, we minimize the risk of bias arising from the randomization process. Okay, so I'm going to be using that term throughout. Safeguards. Safeguards are actions or procedures that we can implement to protect against bias. So why is this important? Biased results can have very profound implications. This is an example of a systematic review result. As you can see here, you don't need to know what this is, I will tell you, but basically this is showing a statistically significant result here, okay? So for those of you that don't know what this is a meta-analysis. Our diamond, our synthesized effect estimate isn't crossing the line of no effect, it's showing that there is a significant effect here. Now, this meta-analysis, I have to also give plaudits to Jennifer Stone, who did this work. She's the convener of the Effectiveness Methods Group, and she gave me this example. This is a meta-analysis for the intervention of paracervical local anesthetic for pain management. And as you can see, what the researchers found was that this type of intervention was associated with decreased pain in women. Okay, this research was published in the BMJ, and it did lead to this type of intervention being used by women in the community. However, in reality, it was highly ineffective. It was actually associated with increased pain, and women that underwent this particular procedure were experiencing pain. So what Jennifer and her team did was that they took this data and they actually reanalyzed it. And for those of you that are unaware, when you run meta-analyses, you do so using what we call models, and these models are statistical parameters that impact the results of that meta-analysis. Jennifer redid this work using what we call a quality effects model, which is another statistical option. A quality effects model adjusts for the bias in each individual study. And what Jennifer found was that when they did this bias, this quality effects model that adjusts for bias, the synthesized effect estimate was no longer significant. Okay, so if this analysis was originally published using a quality effects model, then perhaps their results wouldn't have been recommended, and perhaps women may have been not have experienced this pain unnecessarily. The point being here is that the results of risk of bias assessment can change the results of synthesized research, and it's very important for us that do synthesize research to account for bias in the studies that we're including. The tools that we can use to do a risk of bias assessment, and the reason I've got risk of bias assessment in quotes will hopefully become apparent as I go through this talk. There are many different options for doing critical appraisal. And when I mean options, there are many different tools and formats of tools available to facilitate a systematic reviewer doing a form of risk of bias assessment or quality appraisal, methodological assessment, so on. Each one of these tools employs a different structure, both in its design, in how the tool should be used, and how the results of that tool should be interpreted. And how they're different is important. So there are two main types of structure that a tool for critical appraisal or risk of bias assessment can take. These are scales and checklists. And then within checklists, we have it's not a subdomain, I guess, but it's another form of a checklist tool, which is a domain-based checklist or a domain-based approach, which I'll get into. So those are our main types: scales, checklists, and then domain-based checklists. And most of the study of the tool structures that are available are designed specific to a specific tool. So there's a tool for RCTs, there is a tool for cohort studies, and so on and so forth. There have been a few attempts to make a tool that is specific to multiple study designs, but we'll acknowledge that that's not really specific to this this talk. Okay, so first tool structure is a scale. A scale exists where we present a question about a methodological safeguard, and that question is answered quantitatively. So what we do is we produce this explicit quality score of every study. An example of a tool structure comes from the Downs and Black checklist. As an example of what this looks like, this is the actual example that the Downs and Black checklist provide, right? So we have a question provided, and the question, some questions are related to methodological safeguards that can or cannot be implemented. Now, the answer is then scored on a 0, a 1, or a 2. These are quantitative values, which are then enumerated to produce a total value. So, for example, this first question: is the hypothesis, aim, objective of the study clearly described? This can be scored as a 0, a 1, or a 2. This is done for each question presented, and then a final total score is provided. This means that each study that is appraised using the scale has a potential maximum value and a potential minimum value, and then they are quantitatively enumerated. So that's a scale, right? That's how some tools are designed on scales. The second tool structure are checklists. So a checklist tool is very similar to a scale in terms of its presentation. They questions are presented, but the process of enumerating your responses is not as critical. So instead of answering a question with a 0, a 1, or a 2, you can answer a question typically as a met or an unmet, meaning that methodological safeguard was or was not met. Some developers do permit a checklist to be used like a scale, but the defining feature is that it's not designed to be used like a scale. So an example of a checklist is the JBI critical appraisal checklist. So this is the checklist for case series studies. You can see a question is presented, and these questions are specific to methodological safeguards that can be implemented. and they're answered with a yes or a this is met, a no or this is not met, an unclear or a not applicable. So these questions exist like this. So that's a checklist. And finally, we have domain-based checklists. Now, some checklists, an example of this being the risk of bias, the Cochrane's ROB tools. These are checklists, but the questions presented within them are structured according to the domains of bias that the questions are inherently related to. And then whilst the questions themselves are answered using the, a yes, no format like a checklist, we then prescribe a qualitative judgment to the domain as a whole. So the best way I think I can describe this is with the example from the ROB 2.0 tool. This is what it looks like. For those of you that have used this tool before, you can see that it's an automated form that you fill in. We have the questions as they are presented. So was it allocation sequence random? The response, and the response is it's yes or a no, but in some cases there's also a partially yes, partially no option. So you provide a response to each of the questions, and then they've linked these questions to specific domains of bias. So this domain 1A is the domain of bias related to the randomization process. Now for risk of bias 2.0, this particular tool, and not all domain-based tools, just for this particular tool, there is an algorithm result. And this algorithm is simply based on the responses provided to these questions. The algorithm is suggesting that there is a low risk of bias. However, the assessor's risk of bias is still there. And you can see these are qualitative judgments of value. A risk of bias could be a low risk of bias, it could be a high risk of bias, or it could be an unclear risk of bias. Okay, so domain-based or checklists that follow a domain-based structure have these qualitative judgments prescribed to them. So the JBI critical appraisal tools, as they have existed and continue to exist, are checklists. JBI are deliberately, we use the term non-prescriptive in terms of how we ask reviewers and users of our tools to use them. What I mean by this is people can take a checklist that JBI design and use it as a scale. So they can say, give an answer of a yes to be 1 or an answer of a 0, an answer of no to be 0. And so people using our checklists can use them as a scale. People can use our checklists following that domain-based approach, even though it's not intuitively designed like the ROB 2.0 tool. You can use our checklists following this domain-based structure. Most people, however, use our checklists as checklists and score as a yes or a no, and then present that data in their reviews. The JBI critical appraisal tools also provide this overall critical appraisal of the evidence. And what I mean by that is they don't just assess this idea of risk of bias. And this is one of the key cornerstones of my talk, in that these are different concepts. Critical appraisal can involve risk of bias assessment, but they're not the same thing. Critical appraisal can also include things such as assessment of the generalizability of the study. It can include things such as how well that study was reported, and so on. And the JBI tools do include these types of constructs, as I'm going to talk about, as I'm going to refer to them throughout. So a few problems in risk of bias assessment. By the way, these are not limited to the JBI tools. These are problems in risk of bias assessment as a scientific enterprise. First is that there is very little consensus on how we can actually classify these safeguards, these internal validity safeguards. And this, what I mean by that is, how do we classify certain safeguards to the domains of bias relevant? There is some ambiguity for what domain of bias each question can relate to. if we think back to the previous example of the risk of bias 2.0 tool, there were 3 questions and they were related to the domain of bias related to the randomization process. So there is some ambiguity as to what question each question should be related to. Some of them may be argued to relate to multiple, more than one. There is a combination of multiple constructs. I've talked about this in my previous slide, where some critical appraisal instruments or instruments purporting to be tools to assess risk of bias include things not related to risk of bias. So they relate to things such as reporting. So have they reported an ethics? In the previous example, is their hypothesis or aim clearly reported? Reporting quality, not necessarily bias. And I will spend a bit more time on that towards the end of the presentation. There are different safeguards or mentioned in each tools. So the safeguards that are assessed as part of doing critical appraisal are not necessarily unique for each tool. And so comparability between tools is not always informative or intuitive. And the development of these tools is not always clearly described. And it's also, many of these tools aren't validated or no formal validation processes have taken place, which isn't good or bad necessarily, but it's certainly noteworthy. Okay, part 2. We're now going to talk about the actual methods that we followed as the JBI EMG to actually safeguard our tools for the future. So first thing, we know that the JBI checklists are very popular. We know this through various informal feedback mechanisms that the JBI employ. We know this through publication in our journal, JBI Evidence Synthesis. We know this in formal feedback that we get from our training programs, being the JBI Comprehensive Systematic Review Training Program. And a common theme that runs in this feedback is that they're particularly helpful for novices, particularly helpful for people that don't have that learned experience of doing a critical appraisal previously, which is good. It encourages people to do this when they don't necessarily have had that experience before. But we do acknowledge that the tools as they existed were outdated, and as many of them still do exist, they're outdated. And they're particularly limiting when we compare them to updated tools and recently updated tools. So throughout this process, this presentation, I've presented the Risk of Bias 2.0 tool developed by Cochrane. It's called 2.0 because it was updated from the Risk of Bias 1.0 tool. And there have been multiple updates and revisions of tools previously from other organizations. And when we compared the existing and previous iterations of the JBI tools, they were really lacking in a few key areas. A few important things that they were lacking in: there was ambiguity in how the questions presented in these tools related to domains of bias. We were aware that the tools asked questions not just related to risk of bias, but also related to statistical inclusion validity or reporting standards and so on. And so we knew that outdated. And so we asked the question, okay, let's make a new tool. And asking that question, we then asked another question: what are the ideal characteristics of a risk of bias tool? Forgive how wordy these slides are going to be, so I'll try to jazz them up a bit. First thing is that it should, an ideal risk of bias tool, it should facilitate comparisons across study designs. So it should facilitate a comparison between an RCT and a cohort study, for example. It needs to be sophisticated enough to not only consider the presence or absence of a methodological safeguard, but the impact that is going to have on bias. So the example I have here is, we may not have blinding of our outcome assessors involved in a study, but if I have a hard outcome, such as mortality, is that going to introduce or increase the risk of bias for that outcome? It needs to focus only on issues related to risk of bias and internal validity. There are different tools available for things such as reporting. 4, it should include the use of signaling questions and safeguards. And these questions and safeguards need to be organized according to the domain in which they're most relevant. We need to be able to facilitate judgments at different levels. So traditionally, we assess things at what is known as the study level, but there is also outcome level or result-based level assessments, and I'll provide some examples of those moving on. It needs to map clearly to a comprehensive framework, hierarchy, or taxonomy of bias, and this needs to be structured into different levels. 7, it needs to neatly align with the grade approach, and it shouldn't require any extra work when it comes to assessing the domain risk of bias as part of the grade approach. It needs to be user-friendly, of course, and it needs to be valid and evidence-based. So we identified these were the characteristics of an ideal tool, right? And then we actually need to start doing the work. So the first thing as part of this process and as part of these ideal characteristics was this. We needed to map not only any new tool, but all the existing tools that JBI offered to this framework of bias, okay? And these frameworks of bias needed to be structured into different levels. So let me run through what this process actually involved. There we go. So we have many tools for risk of bias, critical appraisal that JBI offer. This process was only limited to those that were based on quantitative analytic study designs. So we didn't touch the tool for qualitative studies. We didn't touch the tool for text and opinion and so on. This is only for our quant-based studies. For these tools, we looked at every question that was being asked. And then we asked ourselves, okay, what domain of bias does this question map to? So as an example, what I've got on the screen, we have, was true randomization used for assignment of participants to treatment groups? The JBI Effectiveness Methods group mapped this question to the domain of bias related to selection and allocation, okay? We then looked at a range of other available tools for risk of bias assessment and critical appraisal that were available in the literature, that have been peer reviewed, that are validated, and asked ourselves, where is this question asked in these tools, and to what domain of bias does this question map to within these tools? So for example, this question is asked in the master standard under the domain of equal prognosis. ROB 1.0, random sequence generation, ROB 2.0, bias arising from the randomization process, and in both Robbins I and Robbins Z, bias in selection of participants into the study. So this process we followed for every single question that we presented in an existing critical appraisal tool that JBI offered. I'm not going to go any more into the actual details of how we followed, because the entire process is available in this publication. You can view on JBI Evidence Synthesis. But that was the basis of the methods that we followed in terms of how we decided to revise our existing tools. So this led to the actual revised tool. So I'm now going to spend some time talking about the actual tool, the actual revised tools. I'm using the RCT tool as an example. So I will address why this is called a revised tool and not a brand new risk of bias tool, but I'll do that right at the end of the presentation. So the first thing that we identified in doing our mapping is that the questions that we actually asked in these tools were good. They were methodologically relevant. They were similar questions were asked in other tools in this area. And so we didn't necessarily need to change these tools. Also, practically, we didn't need to make, we didn't need to reinvent the wheel, is what I'm trying to argue here. So we didn't decide to change any of the questions. What we have done is we've changed the guidance regarding how to actually answer the questions presented in the tool. We changed the order in which they're presented, and we changed how they are functionally aligned within the tools themselves. So this alignment, we organized at 2 levels. Well, 3 levels, but 2 functional levels, and I'll explain the third in a moment. The first were these ideas of constructs of validity. Okay, so we organized the question based on what construct of validity it was related to. And then depending on that organization, if a question was related to the construct of internal validity, then we organized it according to a domain of bias. Finally, we presented the questions in a way to facilitate judgments at certain levels. And I'll explain exactly what that means in the next few slides. So, constructs of validity. What do I mean by this? I've used this term throughout this presentation already. The term internal validity. Internal validity asks the question, is the study free from systematic error? Systematic error is bias. So some questions by design are related to internal validity. And that's good. These questions are related to risk of bias. But as I've already hinted at throughout this presentation, some questions are not related to internal validity that are presented in these tools. Some questions are related to this idea of statistical conclusion validity. Now, statistical conclusion validity is not related to a systematic error per se. It's related to if the conclusions and the results of a primary study, are they actually based on adequate data analysis, and are the results from this data analysis valid or not? The next construct of validity was comprehensiveness of reporting. So how is the study reported on things? Again, you can see this clearly doesn't relate to error and bias or internal validity. Some questions presented are regarding confounders or ethics statements. These are important regarding how comprehensive a study was reported, but not necessarily related to that study's internal validity, its risk of bias. And then finally, external validity. Now, external validity as a definition refers to, can our results be generalized to populations that didn't necessarily participate in that study? It's quite common. When I say quite common, I mean, it's quite common in terms of people's understanding of it. It's often presented right after external validity, like training and so on. The reason it's at the bottom is because no questions that we asked in the existing JBI critical appraisal tools actually asked the question related to external validity, which again, it's neither good or bad. It's certainly noteworthy though, that they didn't. So these are our constructs of validity, okay? And I've just got an example of the types of questions as they did appear in our checklists. So for internal validity, we had a question related to randomization. Was true randomization used for assignment of participants to treatment groups? This is a question that is clearly related to the construct of internal validity. The question, was appropriate statistical analysis used? This question appears in every single tool that JBI offer for quantitative study designs. This question is related to the idea of statistical conclusion validity. A question like, were the study subjects and the setting described in detail? This is a question related about comprehensiveness of reporting. And as I already mentioned, we didn't actually have a question in the existing JBI checklists that were related to external validity. So those were our constructs of validity. That was our first ordering of the new questions in the revised tool. For each question that was related to internal validity or that construct, we then categorized these questions according to what domain of bias they were related to. So the first domain of bias was selection and allocation, bias related to administration of the intervention or exposure, assessment, detection, measurement of the outcome, participant retention, temporal precedence, classification of the exposure, confounding factors, and finally selective reporting. So these were the domains of bias that each question presented in every checklist could be categorized into if they were related to the construct of internal validity. Now, I'm not going to go through this slide. You can take a screenshot if you want, or I can give you the slides or whatever. But what I've got here is just the domains of bias that we identified as part of this process, and then the safeguards that somebody might implement to reduce the impact of that bias, or a quick definition of that bias. So those were the two, I guess, functional physical components in terms of how we reorganize the questions. Constructs of validity and then domains of bias. But another important thing that we needed to do in this revision was to facilitate people making a judgment on risk of bias at different levels, okay? So the existing JBI critical appraisal checklists were designed to provide what's known as a study level assessment, meaning you answered a question and then your answer to that question was relevant to every outcome and result within that study. And that's fine for some questions, but not fine for another. So as an example, when I say we need to assess bias at a study level, it means that we need to assess safeguards that are implemented, and these safeguards are specific to the entire study. So allocation concealment is a safeguard that we can employ to minimize the risk of bias related to selection and allocation. Allocation concealment is a safeguard implemented that impacts the entire study. That's a study level assessment. We also have outcome level assessments. These are safeguards that are implemented to specific outcomes within the study. So I've already given the example of blinding. When we blind an outcome assessor, we're blinding it for that specific outcome. And some outcomes may not be blinded, some outcomes may not need blinding, but we need to assess the risk of bias per outcome. And then finally, we have our result level. In result levels, we need to assess safeguards that are specific to single results, and you could have multiple results per outcome. So as an example, we might have the outcome, say, pain, and pain might be measured at 24 hours, at 48 hours, and at 72 hours. Now, those are 3 different results for the same outcome. And then we need to assess the risk of bias for each of the results. If we were doing, say, an observational study, we might have an outcome, and we might have an unadjusted estimate. We might have an adjusted estimate adjusted for some confounders. We might have an adjusted estimate for other confounders. These are all different results, and all of those results are related to the same outcome, and all of those need to be assessed independently. So bias needs to be assessed at different levels. So this brings me to my next poll. If somebody could just launch this. I just want to see how we as an audience believe we should be assessing outcomes at these different levels. So for the first question, were outcome assessors blind to treatment assignment? What level should this be assessed at? The study, outcome, or result level? And then for question 2, was true randomization used for assignment of participants to treatment groups? Is this the study, outcome, or result level? And then question 3, were participants analyzed in the groups to which they were randomized? Again, what level should we be answering this particular question? I'll give slightly longer for this because there's a few questions. Okay, excellent. So I'll just keep that up on screen while I go through this. So, were outcome assessors blind to treatment assignment? This should be assessed at the outcome level. Excellent to see most people got that. Was true randomization used for assignment of participants to treatment groups? This should be assessed at the study level. And were participants analyzed in the groups to which they were randomized? This should be assessed at the result level. So in my previous example, we might have pain at 24 hours, 48 hours, and 72 hours, but we might have different loss to follow-up at each of those time points. And we want to make sure that we are always using the intention to treat analysis for each of those time points. So we would do an assessment at each result level. Okay. So those were the functional changes, right, that we needed to implement in the existing or the previous iterations of the critical appraisal tools. What I'm going to do now is actually go through the RCT tool and the changes made. If you wanted to follow along, you can access the new tool from this website, and I'm sure someone can put it in the chat from the global relations team that's on the call. But otherwise, what I'm going to do is just go through the new tool and how it looks. So this is the new RCT tool. You might know, if you're familiar with the JBI checklists, you might see that functionally it does look different. To summarize the changes, I'll keep my discussion limited to these first 3 questions. Okay, so our questions are now ordered according to what domain of bias they're related to. And if these questions are related to internal validity, we've then organized them to sit under that construct. Okay, so we've ordered the questions according to first what construct they belong to, and then if they belong to internal validity, what domain of bias that they are related to. So for example, was true randomization used for assignment of participants to treatment groups? Was allocation to treatment groups concealed? And were treatment groups similar at the baseline? If these questions, these questions are all related to the domain of bias related to selection and allocation. All of the domains of bias are organized under internal validity. You will now also, well, hopefully you'll notice that these questions, so questions 1 to 6, are all questions that need to be assessed at the study level. So the safeguards that we implement to minimize the risk of bias, we implement at the study level. Okay, so we assess these once. Now, the next questions, you'll see this looks a bit different, but it's better exemplified on my next slide. Questions 7, 8, and 9 are questions that need to be answered at the outcome level. So my response to question 8, were outcomes measured in the same way for treatment groups, may change depending on the outcome being assessed. Now, the reason that I've got 7 outcomes here is only because the grade working group and grade guidance suggests that we should include no more than 7 critical outcomes in our evidence profiles and summary of findings tables, because there is some evidence that it impacts decision-making. That's not to say you need to have 7. It's not to say you can't have more than 7, but that's why there is 7 presented here. And so you can remove these if you need it. The point being is that I need to assess question 8, or 7, 8, 9, for each outcome being presented. So if I'm appraising an RCT and it's got 2 outcomes that are relevant to my systematic review, I need to appraise question 8 twice, once per outcome. And finally, we have bias related to participant retention. This is an example of a question that needs to be answered at the result level. So the question was follow-up complete, and if not, were differences between groups in terms of their follow-up adequately described and analyzed? This question is answered at the result level. So for each outcome, if I have multiple results, so for example, I gave the time points or adjusted estimates and so on. If I have multiple results for each outcome, I need to appraise that for each result described. Now, sometimes you won't have multiple results, and that's fine. Sometimes the outcome is just the outcome, and that's it. And so you don't need to appraise it once. But that's why we've presented it in this way. You might have more than 3, you might have less. It's just presented as 3. So that's the new tool. This is it's a redacted version. I'm not going to go through the entire tool, but they're the major functional changes of the tool. It does appear bigger and longer, and it might put people off, but it's the same stuff. It's the same stuff that we've always been doing, just presented slightly differently and presented in a way that facilitates certain different assessments, which I'll get to in my next few slides. So I'm nearly at the end. What's next and future plans? First of all, I want to address the elephant in the room. Why didn't we design a new tool? Well, frankly, we didn't really want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. The JBI critical appraisal checklists were good. The questions presented in the checklists worked. They were answering questions that were being asked in similar tools. There wasn't a need to create a brand new tool from scratch, regardless of the resource implications of doing so. The tools needed to be updated or revised, similar to what Cochrane have done with Risk of Bias 1.0 to 2.0, to acknowledge recent advancements in risk of bias science. There is discussion about potentially doing a brand new tool that only looks at risk of bias assessment, and then tools for reporting quality, and tools for external validity, and then tools for statistical inclusion validity, and so on. But that's why these are presented as revised critical appraisal tools and not new critical appraisal tools. Also, why they're presented as critical appraisal tools for risk of bias assessment. These aren't meant to be risk of bias tools because they address other constructs. These are critical appraisal tools that facilitate risk of bias assessment. Future plans, we are going to do, so we've released the RCT tool. We are going to release the quasi-experimental studies and the cohort studies tool next. They will be done, don't hold me to this, they will be done by the middle of the year, and then focus our attention to case control studies and analytic cross-sectional studies, hopefully by the end of the year, and then case series and prevalent studies. The only reason I've got a question mark there is because the case series study, the publication for that was only in 2020. And so it is more recent compared to some of the other tools. And the prevalent studies tool is also going to be worked on with some external collaborators. And so their timeframes and when they're going to be out, I can't speak to just yet. So thank you. I really appreciate everyone paying attention to me. Please use the tool if you want. I won't be upset if you don't want to. And yeah, I'll be happy if anyone wants to ask any questions.
Thank you, Tim.
Pleasure.
Thank you for that fantastic presentation describing not just the changes made, but also the rationale behind those changes and some of the implications for us as reviewers. Beyond that, there's actually quite a few questions coming through the chat. I'm not sure we'll have enough time to get through all of them, but one of our listeners actually has a really pertinent question, and I know it's a good question because it's a similar question to one that I had. So, you've spoken about changes to the tool, and this is certainly what appears to be a more sophisticated approach for the conduct of risk of bias assessment, critical appraisal, and the JBI systematic review. And currently our approach is, once we've assessed eligibility for our studies, the next step in that process is indeed this. However, to use these tools effectively, I seem to need to be rather intimate with my studies. That is, in terms of what outcomes are being measured, how are they being measured, and in some cases, what's being done to those outcomes. You mentioned adjustments, timing of those measurements. There's a lot going on there before I can comfortably set into critical appraisal with other members of my team. There's a lot of planning seemingly necessary. So just your personal view and the practical use of this, and what are the implications of this new tool on the sequence, our linear process, the way we teach it and the way we generally do it, appraisal, extraction, and like?
Yeah, really good question. And something that I have certainly changed in terms of my processes as a systematic reviewer since developing these tools. So I've used these tools throughout the development processes on some of my students, not as a slave labor kind of way, but as part of their review processes. And what we identified was that exactly as you realized, the first time I did it, I realized I actually don't know what outcomes are relevant here, what needs to be included. And so we did actually change the typical linear process of a systematic review would be, say, at least the way we teach it at JBI, critically appraise, data extract. And I certainly changed my processes to doing those two things together for each study included. So for study one, I would extract first, identify what outcomes were relevant to my systematic review, how they were done, and then appraise. So by the time I got to my appraisal, I could set out my sheet with exactly what outcomes were relevant, what results per outcome were relevant, and then appraise to that level. It does have implications for, I guess, the temporal following of a systematic review in terms of what we normally teach it, but it doesn't have any implications in terms of findings of your review and the importance of those findings. Just, I guess, a logical understanding of how we do things practically.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. And I think that's some fantastic food for thought for anyone who plans to use this tool now during the conduct of their review. I'm just going to combine a couple of other questions that have come through. So you presented a list, basically a domains of bias list, and that then these safeguards were mapped to. So the question I have for you, is that list indeed exhaustive when we're considering bias? And in this regard, was factor analysis performed to determine the domains of bias for any particular tool?
Okay, so the first question, certainly not exhaustive. It was just what I could fit onto a slide without it looking any worse than what that's probably the worst slide.
I guess beyond that, did the group consider beyond that, or was that the full list that the group considered for these safeguards?
Yes, so we did consider things beyond that, and those considerations are they're documented in these specific tools when we produce them. So, for example, if you read the publication for the tool for RCTs, each question we've got a section on how it should be answered, and it includes what safeguards should be or can be looked at as a reviewer. What are the things you're trying to identify? And there's far more detail in all of those than I actually provided. What was the second part of the question? Oh, sorry, did I answer that first?
Yep, thank you. The second, I guess, is was factor analysis performed to determine the domains of the tool?
To determine the domains.
The domain of the particular tool, the domains of bias that were actually relevant.
No, it wasn't. It was based on this mapping, these I'll say Delphi-like approaches, a lot of consultation, a lot of discussion with the effectiveness methods group over a long time, mind you. This process started early 2021, and we've only just finished this. The entire process is documented, but it didn't involve factor analysis, unfortunately.
I have one final question. There are lots of questions here, and we will keep record of all of these. And I think some of these are worthwhile that the effectiveness methods group might wish to get back to some of the participants, but some really good questions. But there's another one really pertinent for anyone conducting the JBI review. What are the plans? Does the group have any advice, guidance about how to actually present this in the manuscript? What's it going to look like? The overall risk of, and also not just the individual, but overall risk of bias in terms of the summary assessments for any particular study?
Well, yes, we have plans. The guidance that we provide, it is in the paper. One of the questions was structurally, these tools remain the same in terms of we are deliberately non-prescriptive in how you want to use them. If you want to use these new tools as a scale, that's fine. If you want to use these new tools as a traditional Cochrane-based qualitative judgment domain approach with the green, low risk, red, high risk, you can, because the questions are now ordered according to their domains of bias. So you can now do that. We are not going to provide any guidance on what we believe you should do. Those decisions should always come down to the review team and what is pertinent to your review question and what the review team are comfortable with. The point is, you can do that. We have examples in the publication of what we would suggest would be ideal ways to do it. And yeah, I guess that's it.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for that sound advice, Tim. Fantastic.
Pleasure.
I'm just going to finish up very briefly because we should not be going over time. I hope you can see that on my screen. I just would like to highlight to everyone here, as Tim has already, that everything that Tim's been speaking about, in particular the current tool, is available in the current, the new tool, sorry, the revised tool is available in the current issue of JBI Evidence Synthesis. It's in the March issue, and it is free as the output of one of the JBI methodology groups. It is freely available for any user, and the tool itself you can find just by clicking there on the supplemental digital content as a part of the manuscript. As Tim did mention, you can find this tool. Also, the previous version is still available, but any of our tools are available via the JBI website with the whole family of JBI critical appraisal tools, dependent on the type of study design you are appraising and including in your review. And the web link is there for you. And certainly the guidance is all available in our wonderful online textbook, the JBI Manual for Evidence Synthesis. And I must say, all of this work that Tim's been talking about is just one small part of all of the work this group is doing. And we do soon enough, I dare say, there will be a brand new chapter incorporating all of this within the JBI Manual for Evidence Synthesis for all of those intrepid reviewers out there. So on that note, I'd just like to say thank you again to Tim, a very big thank you for a fantastic presentation. Thank you to all of you who joined online. I do hope you found that very, very interesting and useful. An evaluation link will be provided straight after this webinar ends. We'd really appreciate you completing that so we can grab some of your feedback about our presentations and our webinars. And for further information, you can always visit our website. And of course, there's a whole host of previous webinars, and this one will appear soon enough at our wonderful YouTube channel. And an email address there is provided for any other thoughts that you may have. So on that score, thank you everyone, and do stay tuned for that next JBI live webinar, which will be with you soon enough. Take care. Thank you.